So, Craig, you've come over from London where you've been curating an exhibition on the Troubles for the Imperial War Museum, which is a really important development, I think, in engaging with the history of the conflict and its ongoing repercussions. I mean, can you just perhaps begin by just telling us a little bit about how that came about and how you managed to achieve this in England?
I think the idea behind the exhibition generated some point in mid-2018, as far as I remember, with a change in sort of senior management, and there was a new sort of ideas for exhibition programming, and one of the ones that was mooted to do was something to do with Northern Ireland, although it was a fairly vague idea at the time. I'd always been very keen that we tackle something to do with the Troubles. The museum itself had never ever dedicated anything purely to it. There'd been spaces in galleries, but part of larger things, or there'd been smaller art pieces that had been dedicated to Troubles, but nothing that ever really would ever explain to MD what had happened during the Troubles, if you will, and what the reasoning behind it was, where it came from, what the history was. So I got on board with this fairly early on, ended up being allocated to deal with the exhibition. In fact, the only curator on it. I had a long-standing interest in the history. Growing up, it'd always been on TV, etc. Come from the west coast of Scotland, it sort of resonates quite strongly, I find. And so basically, it started to move from the end of 2018 when I went over to a museum conference, the Museum Association conference in Belfast, just to hear speakers, but mainly to explore the city and find some ideas, some inspiration for how this was going to be tackled, what was the direction I was going to use, what we were going to cover, basically, what angle to take, if you will. And it sort of came from a walking tour in East Belfast that sort of terminated around St Matthew's Church at the interface between Bryson Street and Newton Ards Road, where a member of the Loyalist community handed over to a member of the Republican community in Short Strand after explaining about this event in 1970 around St Matthew's at the very beginning of the Troubles. For the first time, the newly formed Provisional IRA come out here and also in Ardoyne, and the same time after the White Rock Parade starts, after one of the flute bands comes back from that, and what starts as a riot ends up with shots being fired and 3 people dead by the next morning. And I found what came out of this was interesting was the way that these 2 members of different communities who would never have been in touch before or would have gone near each other sort of had a laugh, talked about it, and with the sort of words along the lines of, well, you've heard the truth of the event, now you're going to hear their version of events. And it sort of struck me that this idea of telling your own narrative, your own story, was some way that in which piece of a sort is maintained. And I thought, there's an angle for the exhibition. And so that was the sort of the germ of the idea where the exhibition came from, this event in 1970. And in the exhibition, that forms one of the main parts at the beginning of it, to sort of seed in the idea of the visitor that so much of what you will hear is contested, and there isn't really an agreed narrative that runs through the history of the Troubles. People have shared experiences, but not necessarily a shared memory, if you will.
Was that a surprise to you? Because I'm struck by, I mean, I've done some work on thinking about the difficulties of talking about and representing the Troubles, you know, and the lack of engagement, I suppose, with the peace process in Britain, perhaps particularly in England. I mean, was it a surprise, or did you that contested history thing, or were you struck in, you know, new ways? I mean, presumably you knew something about, you know, the contested nature of it, but that personal connection that you get on those walking tours is something else, isn't it?
I thought, yeah, I think it wasn't the fact that they disagreed on something, but they could tell the narrative. That was the thing that more surprised me, the way that could be engaged with. I was well aware of the fact that people didn't agree, but the fact that could be seen as a way to deal with an event, a controversial event, and how that could be dealt with in a non-aggressive or a non-confrontational manner, that they could basically be speaking, could be shaking hands and being friendly about an event, but they could both tell their side of the story. So yeah, that was interesting, but not entirely unsurprised.
I mean, how does that play into the idea of the controversial nature of the history? It presumably explains why there hasn't been a major exhibition for 50 years at the War Museum. What does it mean to address what's controversial when you then take that perspective from East Belfast back to London?
I think that's the thing. There are people who might disagree completely that there is any, in England may disagree that there's actually any contested narrative, that there's just this, that, you know, this happened, the IRA were on this side, the British Army were on this side, and that's it. You know, there isn't any sort of grey areas as far as some people might have been concerned. But what I was very keen to get across was that this is how things are. This is not an easy narrative to follow. It's very difficult. And in many senses, I wanted the visitors to be uncomfortable, although there was a sort of helping hand through it with a sort of curator's voice that I wrote through it to explain my thinking, to help. But at the same time, I didn't want them to have it too easy. I just hoped they would think a lot more about what happened and realise that you're not going to get an easy path through this, because you should. If you don't know this, you should be knowing this, or at least you should be engaging with it in some sense and find out a bit more, maybe leave the exhibition, maybe get a book on it, and maybe, and even if you disagree with it completely, which is entirely, you're right, walk away and find out something different. And if it engages in some way, then it's done its job in some senses, I think, yeah.
I mean, I think that idea of exploring, pushing into what's uncomfortable, what's unsettling. I mean, I think that that's one of the areas in the network that we found very productive for moving beyond the kind of fixed narratives or the kind of, you know, official or conventional languages to talk about things. I mean, how did you go about constructing the exhibition as an unsettling experience? Yeah,
I mean, apart from just this idea of the contested narrative, it was, how do we do it? Is it a chronological story we tell? Or is it a story of events? Is it a story of experience? And in some senses, it's a kind of, it was never really chronological, although in some senses, in short text paths, it's explained that the Troubles as a conflict changes and mutates, if you will, over the decades from the 70s to the 80s. Things change, the role of the military and the police change, the attitudes, the political attitudes to Northern Ireland change in the 70s and 80s, what have you, and how the IRA takes itself forward from 76 and changes its strategy. So there are changes, but it doesn't run in that sort of way. It sort of explains things, I think, such as how the violence comes about and how people lived with that kind of situation in Northern Ireland, how they tried to get on with everyday life with the presence of soldiers and the presence of paramilitaries and bombings and shootings and checkpoints and what have you. So I think it was more, I think as well, I mentioned when we were talking yesterday about the constraints of space. You may, when you start drawing up ideas for an exhibition in the back of a notebook and pan it out, you're given, this is your gallery space, and you think, okay, that's not nearly as big as what I wanted, but you know what, you kind of have to work with what you've got, and just, so you sort of sometimes have to change the way your ideas and your concepts work, because you think, okay, I'm never going to be able to do all this, so I'm going to have to work out what is important, or what is going to get across the message about this that I'm trying to get people to take away from it. And then somebody said to me when I was saying, yeah, a few people said, oh, I wish it could have been bigger, and I said, well, so do I. One person said to me, actually, I think the space isn't the issue here. I think the fact it's smaller allows you to take away key messages better than perhaps a more expansive exhibition, which again I thought was another interesting point to take away. So, yeah.
I guess in some ways the exposure for people in Britain, although the War Museum is also an international, you know, place, isn't it? So you're getting people coming in, so that must have been quite a challenge thinking about how you're kind of presenting the history. But I guess certainly in England, the sense that of people not knowing that you get that thing where, you know, anybody's encountered, and I used to get this through teaching, you know, courses on the Troubles, and it's like, oh, I didn't know that was happening, and it's like, you know, this is going on in our state, you know. So actually knowing anything about it at all can be quite shocking.
I think that's it. I mean, we did front-end evaluation to sort of get a gauge of what the knowledge was among a sort of an audience group who would consider themselves to be well read, to be cultured, to visit galleries, this type of thing, and it had a variation of age groups from 20s through to like sort of late 40s or into the 50s, I think, actually. But what you got was a sort of, we actually found the bar of understanding was less than we even hoped for. So we realised when we did the intro film, it was going to have to do quite a bit of heavy lifting in that sense and get people up to speed relatively quickly. I mean, older people, some of them would recall bombings in London, whereas younger people didn't have much idea. They may have heard about Good Friday Agreement and thought, well, isn't it this thing over with now? And other than that, they were really quite confused. But at the same time, being confused, there was a sort of a fear around the Troubles, and also an embarrassment that they didn't really fully comprehend what it was. And at a certain level, we should know this, but we don't. And so it was kind of what the exhibition was hoping to do, was to engage with us, I suppose, the English audience. We also get quite a large American audience. After the UK audience, it's largely Americans, and then there's a sort of, I think the way they look at the stats, it's sort of like French, German, Spanish after that, but largely American after UK. And obviously America has its own issues with the Troubles, or the attitudes towards what went on there as well. So it was to try and sort of bring a sort of greater understanding to the conflict from what they might have thought they knew or didn't know, and hope that they sort of, although maybe confused or maybe unsettled by it, maybe walk away with more questions to ask and more curiosity around this and why they should know about it.
Great. Thanks. Questions and curiosity, we'll leave it there.